Hello, everyone. This is Trisha Ramsey. Appreciate your patience. And on behalf of Sumo Logic and 451 Research, which is now a part of S&P Global Market Intelligence, I would like to welcome you and say thank you for attending today's webcast titled Adopting a Cloud-First Strategy for Modernizing Security Operations. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. To ask a question, simply type it in the question box on your screen. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A session. The presentation slides are available for download in the resources section in the console. And finally, the on-demand version of this webinar will be available for download once the live event concludes. Leading off today's discussion will be Scott Crawford, who is Research Director for the Information Security Channel at 451 Research. Joining Scott will be Girish Bhat, who is Vice President of Security at Sumo Logic. We welcome our speakers today, and with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thank you, Tricia, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session today. We're going to talk about a trend that we've been seeing unfolding over some time, but has experienced some acceleration over the last several months for a number of reasons, and that's the increasing movement toward the adoption of cloud-delivered, cloud-based, cloud-native, if you will, security information and event management, or SIEM systems. These are systems that are central to the administration and management of security operations for a number of organizations and service providers. There's a lot of reasons why we're seeing organizations increasingly embrace cloud SIEM. We're going to talk about some of those drivers as we go through our discussion today. We're going to talk about how we see digital transformation unfolding, and in particular where we see organizations embracing and adopting cloud first, cloud native, cloud predominant deployments for IT and for security operations. We're also going to talk some about the nature of security operations when it comes to integrating with cloud environments and for managing the security of cloud environments. What's different about those types of environments and requirements? And lastly, we're going to take a look in particular at the trend that is variously called work from home, work from anywhere, work from everywhere, depending on how you think about it. What that means for security operations as well, because security operations are also moving towards a more virtual method of operation. So with that, let's get started and take a look at, let's kind of trace where we come from and where we are now with respect to the embrace of cloud technology and what that means for IT and specifically IT security operations. Traditionally, of course, IT has typically been what we might consider a homegrown endeavor, meaning that we have for many years thought about IT as being primarily deployed on premises within the enterprise's own facilities, within an enterprise data center, using physical hardware infrastructure, licensed software that's permanently installed and deployed, maintained, upgraded, and managed by an organization itself. We've seen an awful lot of investment in networks that are deployed on premises within the brick and mortar, if you will, facility of the enterprise, and tremendous dependence on just the physical form factor, physical deployment of IT on an organization's own premises. With the rise of initial service providers, and then, of course, with the expansion of cloud computing, advances in technologies, beginning with virtualization, we've seen the increased adoption of centralized IT facilities that has historically been deployed in the enterprise data center, now being deployed among third-party cloud providers. The same technologies the cloud providers use also being deployed by enterprises themselves. Basically using these types of hosted third-party remote, if you will, deployment models for what had historically been deployed on premises as an enterprise-owned and operated function. So considerable and increased and growing reliance on third-party providers for cloud and SaaS applications that has historically been served and delivered by the enterprise. At the same time, we've been seeing a continued expansion not only of enterprise endpoints, but in the variety of those endpoints. And this Really, you might think of this as having begun with the explosion in mobile connectivity, mobile devices a decade or more ago. But now we've seen that continue to grow even more substantially with the increased emphasis on remote access, with the increased emphasis on operational technologies and a whole variety of endpoints that hadn't traditionally been considered traditional IT in the sense of laptops, mobile devices designed primarily for end user computing. So now we have this tremendous explosion in third-party hosted application services, a tremendous explosion in endpoints and their ability to access and connect from virtually anywhere. But in terms of enterprise architecture, we still have this concept predominantly as a legacy network that a lot of organizations connect to. And yes, a lot of these new services can be connected to directly by any endpoint from anywhere, but we still have this tendency to bring traffic back through the legacy network. And why? Primarily for security reasons. Part of it is for policy definition and enforcement, for access control. Part of it is for the deployment of security monitoring, security visibility. So to have visibility into the traffic that moves between these endpoints and centralized compute resources, whatever they might be, we still have this tendency to bring traffic back through the enterprise network primarily for those security reasons. And yet we still have a continued migration not only towards an increased profusion of endpoints, but also to an increased variety of the nature of those endpoints. Not only operational technologies, but the Internet of Things and industrial IoT technologies and, if you will, smart devices of all different kinds, including in some cases a number of traditional devices or systems that might be considered consumer technology being brought into the enterprise, enabling this extreme remote connectivity at the edge or the increased proliferation of high availability, high performance technologies like 5G, and with that, all the growth in so-called edge computing technologies and techniques that we see beginning to predominate in the enterprise. So this trend is not slowing down. You may have seen a great deal of focus on centralized compute resources in the cloud, but it is also growing now towards the edge and an increased profusion of endpoints as well. And as we take a closer look at, particularly at the center, what's characterizing trends towards centralized IT is indeed a move towards more cloud native, if you will, cloud delivered technologies, the types of technologies that were developed primarily to serve the demands of cloud computing, which is predicated, first of all, on scale. Cloud computing architectures are predicated on the ability to make large volumes of computing functionality, computing capability available to large numbers of, in the case of third-party and cloud service providers, subscribers. The idea being that we should also be employing technologies that enable high elasticity in response to demand, to have that demand be able to scale flexibly or elastically, if you will, as demand fluctuates, increases, and grows. And so the adoption of technologies to make centralized IT more agile in all these areas has driven the adoption of not only cloud services delivered by third parties, but also cloud-native technologies as deployed by enterprises. So here, we see an example of research from our 451 research survey data. When we ask organizations the types of deployment models that they plan to adopt over the next couple of years, and you'll see from this graphic predominantly organizations, the majority of respondents, in fact, 52%, indicating that their workloads will be primarily executed in public cloud environments within the next couple of years, but not just public cloud environments. They're going to be looking to hosted third-party services for the majority of compute, and even when they don't look at hosted or third-party technologies, they're still looking at a lot of these, if you will, cloud-native technologies to improve the responsiveness and elasticity even of their own computing environments when they deploy them in their data centers themselves. So it's not just the third-party cloud. It's the approach to cloud technology that is changing the nature of the game in terms of centralized IT, centralized compute, and with it changing the nature of enterprise IT itself. And in fact, really depending on the use case, those use cases may influence the deployment models and the way that organizations embrace cloud and cloud computing. For customer-facing functions, for example, there will be quite a bit of emphasis on SaaS applications that are readily delivered, consumable directly by the end user, by the relying party, as applications in total themselves. And so for things like customer-facing functions, that seems intuitive. You want to deliver applications that customers can consume directly, and SaaS is often a preferred model of that, as you see in the central column here for that particular use case. For data and analytics, it really kind of runs the gamut, but organizations are definitely looking at hosted, public cloud for infrastructure and platform as a service to take advantage of the variety of tools and methodologies that cloud service providers are making available in their environment to enable organizations to build their approach to data and analytics, to enable specific use cases for analytics in those cases. Employee productivity applications can pretty much run the gamut, whether they're SaaS, whether they're deployed as infrastructure as a service applications developed by an organization, really kind of a variety of models. So to some extent it depends on use case, but in every case we see this wide variety and overall a significant increase in adoption of cloud-delivered, cloud-native technologies that, again, are characterizing the nature of enterprise IT going forward. Why are organizations doing this? Well, I see a number of benefits to IT as deployed and delivered in the cloud. Scaling, of course, I mentioned that earlier. That's one of the primary reasons that organizations look to cloud providers, the ability to access compute at scale, the ability to adapt that scale on demand very flexibly and elastically as needed. Centralized data repositories. This means something in particular, particularly for security operations, because in security we do want to collect a large volume of data. We don't always know what data is going to be the most useful or insightful for us. We'd like to have that available, but we'd like to have that availability also be fairly immediate. We'd like to be able to get to analysis of that data fairly quickly, on demand as available. We like to do that by minimizing the cost impact of that as well too. This is one area where cloud providers really can excel in delivering that scale of data storage, data intake, and management at scale at very competitive cost. As far as optimization across dedicated on-demand resource environments, the availability of cloud from virtually any access point is another advantage to a cloud-based deployment, as opposed to proprietary deployment on-premises by an enterprise, where the enterprise has to engineer that availability for their own use cases. So for all these reasons, reducing the cost, in many cases, investment of IT, reducing the capital investment, reducing the ongoing management and maintenance burden, which an organization would ordinarily have to undertake for itself, these are all advantages that turning to a cloud service provider, to cloud technologies, to optimize these values, among the many reasons that organizations are embracing more cloud-native approaches to IT, if you will. And of course, we see these same benefits being extended to security information and event management, or cloud SIEM, as well. In fact, as we've looked at the adoption of SIEM technologies over the last couple of years, we asked our survey respondents last year the extent to which they were embracing on-premises infrastructure for their SIEM deployment versus a cloud-based tool, regardless whether that tool is a non-SaaS or deployed as infrastructure as a service within those types of environments, or adopted as SaaS technology itself. And just over the course of the last year, we've seen a pretty significant growth in the embrace of a cloud-based tool. And by the way, these totals here may add up to more than 100%. Organizations may adopt more than one form factor, may depend on use case, may depend on the distributed organization, more complex organizations with multiple business units, for example. In any event, this represents the total of investments that organizations are reporting to us in their surveys. And over the course of just this past year, the number of survey respondents by percentage that told us they were embracing a cloud-based tool has gone from 41 to 52% just over the last 12 months. and a bit of a decline as well in terms of the embrace of on-premises infrastructure among these respondents as well. It's declined by 5% among organizations. So we're seeing organizations that see the values of a cloud-based deployment model for security information and event management specifically as a central anchor point of security operations. And in fact, looking at, we're going back to the slide where we were looking at the values that organizations are embracing for why they're turning to cloud deployment for SIEM. One of the values that stands out for SIEM that isn't as frequently reported as meeting high expectations among organizations for cloud deployment models in general is this idea of bringing disparate IT environments under a single management framework. That's a fairly general question, but what we mean is basically centralizing the administration of IT under a single framework of operations. When you have a number of different applications that you're employing for different use cases, be that internal operations or customer-facing operations, whatever that may be, it may still be difficult to consolidate those under one single operational umbrella. But this is an area where SIEM, for security operations, does have a centralizing function. SIEM is often the nexus and the focus for information that's gathered and used to monitor and maintain visibility into security posture, to respond to security issues and events as they arise, has always served that centralizing function for security operations. And this is one area where a cloud deployment can offer further advantages even for SIEM. A cloud deployment model centralizes those operations, that functionality, regardless where IT resources may be located. So you may be serving hundreds, thousands of endpoints in very distributed environments, remote workers, operational technologies, and so on. A cloud deployment model offers, in many cases, a very readily accessible central point of collection, also analysis, but also access to findings for the part of security operations personnel, regardless where they may be. So this is an advantage that Cloud SIEM can offer that in many cases, not even cloud deployments generally can offer to the same degree.
Hey, Scott, I have a question for you. So
Sure.
Going back to the previous slide, if you can jump back to the previous slide. Perfect. So I really loved the approach that you took where you're sharing the evolution of enterprise IT, plus you're highlighting the cloud transformation and cloud as well as the digital transformation impact on IT as well as security. We all know we are just emerging in the post-pandemic world we all lived in. We are just about, there are signs that we are emerging out of it. My question is, we've talked about this previously. Any other trends as to why the timing is better now than before? Meaning we've talked about digital transformation. The cloud journey has started 10 plus years ago. Are there other factors, Scott?
Right. Yes, there are, in fact, Girish, a number of other factors. We'll get into some of these in a little bit more detail, but just to kind of summarize. Over the case of the past year, we've seen, obviously, a lot of organizations have to make accommodations for working from anywhere, and that includes for security operations as well, too. So there's a few things that are coming together under that general driver. One of them is, as I discussed earlier, the fact that we're now seeing IT become even more distributed, not just centralized computing on cloud resources, but also this wider variety of endpoints, and now locations from which workers of virtually any kind can connect from. And this doesn't include people who typically work just in an office. It also extends now to smarter logistics, if you will. Compute in the field, smart devices in virtually any industry. But also for security operations teams as well. We'll talk about this again in some more detail a little bit later on, but historically, security operations teams have gathered into security operations centers. But accommodation has to be made for these teams as well to work virtually from anywhere. And in fact, it's not just the pandemic in these cases. It's also the fact that security expertise is very precious long experience is not always easy to find and retain, as many organizations are well aware. Making the work environment more accessible for these highly skilled individuals, and conversely, making it more accessible for them to be engaged in their work from any setting, it increases the opportunity, increases the availability of both the work environment and access to this expertise for the organization. So there's a number of factors that are coming together here. And again, we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but the pandemic may be a forcing factor for a lot of this in terms of work from anywhere. But it's been a catalyst for some of these factors that we've been seeing shaping up for a number of years.
Yeah, one quick observation
from your perspective.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, so a couple of observations quickly on the top, where you're highlighting the app scaling and apps lifecycle. So one of the common themes we have heard in the past several years, even pre-pandemic, and continues, app modernization. Right? This is where the business is looking at modernizing their IT and applications within their organization, and they're looking at security to be one of the enablers as part of it. So I'm spot on there. When I look at the top one, 80% of them are saying that it exceeds or meets expectation, and in the other cases across the life cycle, there seems to be a little bit work, but these are positive trends. Back to you, Scott.
Yeah, and that modernization, again, extends to security operations as well, too. In fact, as we discussed a little bit earlier, one of the drivers for cloud adoption is increased availability of analytics technologies such as machine learning. Cloud providers have access to this type of technology, and they also have access to it at scale, and also ways that can distribute the cost across an entire subscriber base. So this makes these technologies a lot more accessible to a lot wider swath of potential users and customers. So again, another advantage of not just modernization of the form factor of the applications and how applications are developed and deployed, but access to technologies that are meaningful to security operations as well too. So yeah, you're right. Factoring into app modernization does play a role in the modernization applications, software, functionality for security operations itself. And again, another reason why organizations are turning to cloud technologies for these purposes in security per se. So great points, great observations. Let's take a little bit closer look about what's different about the nature of cloud native technologies, if you will. And by that we mean the technologies that were developed primarily to serve the availability, elasticity, scalability, on-demand availability of cloud computing and cloud technologies. To throw out some concepts and ideas that may be top of mind in this regard, starting, of course, with virtualization, but certainly going on from there to containers and containerized, container-delivered functionality, to functionality delivered as a service in any respect, including even more granular decomposition, if you will, of applications into so-called serverless functionality, which is functions available as a service themselves. So the components of applications available as services and callable via API. But even so, as we look to, Girish, to your point about app modernization, as we look at organizations that are looking to upgrade their applications or modernize them to these more cloud-native environments, security remains one of the primary drivers for these initiatives. In fact, when we ask organizations what are the factors influencing their selection of workload venue, cloud, cloud native, service provider, third party, and so on, security winds up being the factor that they report most often. Nearly 3/4 of our respondents, 70%, say security is even more frequently reported as a motivating factor than even cost or platform reliability. And part of that factors in relation to what you were talking about with respect to app modernization, the fact that cloud providers must have a reliable and predictable platform on which to base their success, or people won't return to it, won't look to it as a preferred alternative for their computing needs. That means a high degree of standardization, specification, consistency, and repeatability in their patterns of deployment and the ways in which they define and administer their operations. And security benefits from that high degree of organization, that high degree of maturity in terms of approach to their environment. So this makes a great deal of sense. Even when questions arise as far as third-party custody and shared responsibility models, even so, this notion of discipline over the environment does carry a lot of weight with enterprises who see this as a value and a reason why they embrace cloud deployments for their security values. But this also means that organizations are increasingly going to need to rely on an increased degree of cloud platform expertise, and this extends to security as well too. And this concerns organizations because when it comes to in-demand expertise, if we look at those that are determined to be most important today, but also most inadequately addressed or most difficult to address, if you will, we see a convergence point here in terms of cloud platform expertise. On the one hand, one thing that stands out here is we see some security expertise really standing out as being the most important today. Security architecture, security operations, network security expertise, identity and access management. Those are the four data points that stand out the most as being the most important and in demand today. But look at what's being identified as being the most inadequately addressed today. At the top of the stack here is cloud platform expertise. And that's going to weigh on security teams in particular because as we see this increased migration towards cloud environments, combined with the existing demand for security expertise, organizations are going to have to find ways to bring that together. Visibility into cloud operations, visibility into these cloud-native environments, and that means visibility into expertise in DevOps techniques, tools, operations, and so on. All of these are becoming increasingly more important to defining and administering the security of these environments, both today and going forward. And there are reasons that this needs to be brought to the attention of security operations teams per se. One of them is that for a long time, we've really depended, particularly in SIEM, on a model that, if you will, pushes primarily log data to the SIEM. That's where a lot of the insight about the nature of events in the IT environment, that's how it comes to the SIEM, and through that, that's how it comes to security operations teams. But that depends on those environments and those resources being able to generate that information in the form of log data and push it, if you will, to the SIEM. Not all environments natively generate that information, nor do they natively push it to the SIEM. In fact, in terms of endpoint technologies, this is an area in which we've seen as a driver towards the adoption of endpoint and extended threat detection and response by going to those environments, pulling information from their instrumentation, and bringing it back to security operations. For cloud-native environments, like any application, logging depends on whether or not the application developers have actually written logs to be produced by those applications. But a lot of time, that sort of instrumentation and visibility comes from the underlying environment or platforms on which these applications are built and developed. Those platforms that are designed to stage, develop, build, and deploy these more modern, often DevOps, if you will, environments, do have that instrumentation, but they provide the instrumentation and the visibility into the overlaying environments that they support and the overlaying applications that they support. And this means that for security operations, and for SIEM in particular, we're going to see going forward, I expect to see rather going forward, a lot more emphasis on the instrumentation and visibility available from what have been called IT observability platforms, specifically for security operations. Now, that's one example of how this sort of information and capability is coming to security operations. But there's another aspect to that. And that's, okay, so you have that instrumentation, you have that visibility. Now, what do your SecOps teams actually do with it? That's predicated on a knowledge of what those teams are actually seeing. And then that gets into the visibility that's required for security operations teams to know what they're looking at. So here again, this convergence of familiarity with cloud native and DevOps native tools and techniques are going to become increasingly necessary for security operations personnel to become familiar with, to know what they're seeing, to know that security issues and events are arising in those environments, and to take action before they have impact on the organization. And probably as good an example of that as any is what we've seen over the last few weeks in terms of the types of threats that have been carried out against IT operations platforms, the type of platforms that IT operations teams depend on for visibility into their network environment, visibility into their IT operations environment and resources. Well, those software components are often delivered to IT operations teams. As with any enterprise software, they're built by a provider, by a supplier. The enterprise receives updates to them that are delivered typically as signed updates and are therefore installed and deployed as being trustworthy because they're signed by the developer and the deployer. But if you're building those environments, you need to have visibility into the activity in the building and development of those environments to be sure that what you're building is as secure as you expect it to be, and more importantly, as secure as your relying parties expect it to be. And that means security operations for these types of environments are going to have greater literacy into the nature of DevOps operations and DevOps functionality, and even within development organizations themselves. So here again, these are a couple of examples of where security operations teams are going to need both better telemetry into these environments and better expertise into what goes into these environments in terms of activity that they need to be aware of security posture, to manage and respond to security incidents and events as they arise.
Yeah, Scott, one point I was going to make on that is, so we have seen many customers and others trying to do a lift and shift model, and that doesn't work. To your point about if I use the example of the hyperscaler platforms, each of them have a slightly different approach to doing things, and knowing not only what the hyperscaler platform is about, and to your point about whether it is what kind of logging support they have, is it native or is it hybrid? All these are nuances that if you don't know upfront, you'll run into problems quite often. And that's what we are seeing from our customer base. That is just a traditional, I'm going to lift and shift everything that I'm doing on-prem or legacy way to the cloud and call it cloud native because it's hosted on a hyperscaler platform, just doesn't work.
Right. You'll still need visibility into operational factors affecting the underlying platform, meaning you'll still need the visibility into whether that underlying platform is performing as you expected. You'll need visibility into its availability. You need visibility into whether or not it is having service or performance problems, because if you don't, then you're going to run into problems with whatever you lifted and shifted into those environments as well. Typically, that insight comes from APIs into those environments, but it may come from the deployment platform on which the overlying application itself has been deployed, regardless whether provided by the cloud service provider or is a tool that your organization is using. So you're right. Regardless what the deployment model is in the cloud, you still need visibility into the underlying architecture that supports those environments, and you're going to need literacy and observability in those environments and observability into their operations as well. So really good points. Let's go back to the topic of work from anywhere. I alluded a little bit to security operations being affected by this as well, but let's think about that in a little bit more detail. When we surveyed organizations 3 different times this past year here at 1251 Research about how the coronavirus pandemic was affecting them, affecting their operations, what they expected to see in terms of outcomes, particularly in terms of longer-term outcomes. And we dug into a couple of areas on this in particular. One of them is, of course, we saw a lot of organizations enabling work from home or really work from anywhere. They stepped up their investments in the short term early on for things like collaboration, cooperative work environment tools, so document sharing, access to process management systems that would enable highly distributed workers to work together, even on sequential processes. So a lot of these technologies we saw adoption for early on, but we also asked organizations, did they expect this transition to become enduring or long-term? In other words, regardless of recovery from the pandemic, did organizations expect remote work to endure even after the pandemic had largely passed? And a lot of them told us yes. And in fact, during the course of last year, by October of last year, in fact, 69% of enterprises told us that at least 3/4 of their workforce can work effectively remotely. And when we asked them if they expected their COVID-19 inspired practices to become a permanent policy, nearly 2/3 of them, 64%, said, first of all, they expected to see a significant increase in remote working permanently. 32% said they expected a reduction in office footprint also to be permanent. If you think about it, a good deal of reason for this is they're making significant investments in enabling this remote work and, in fact, reducing the office footprint. And there's good reasons for that to continue and endure. One of them is the capital costs of maintaining offices. One of them, if you will, is the carbon footprint and the environmental impact of maintaining facilities when workers could work as efficiently and effectively in remote settings. So a lot of organizations expect these changes to endure even beyond the pandemic. Well, this has implications for security operations as well. Security operations teams, if they have access to the data, if they have access to the analytics, if their visibility across the environment, across the IT environment is sufficiently centralized that they can work as effectively remotely as they could in a physical security operations center, then why wouldn't organizations consider it? Organizations, in fact, have had to consider this to enable security operations during the pandemic. Given the increased proliferation of cloud technologies and increased accessibility of work from anywhere, this now becomes a factor for security operations teams as well. In fact, going back to what we were talking about as far as the transition of IT more towards these highly distributed environments, but security organizations, but connectivity still being brought back through centralized points of contact, like through the VPN, we see organizations that are really feeling the pinch of that. In fact, relying on the VPN as your primary means for deploying security policy definition and enforcement and security visibility isn't always as reliable as a lot of organizations would like it to be, even with VPN in place. And in fact, lost telemetry is a concern for organizations in some cases. We do see organizations looking increasingly to make up telemetry that they may be losing from legacy on-premises networks through things like increased reliance on corporate endpoints, but also through visibility into hosted resources in the cloud, directly from applications, or from the resources that they're using to monitor and mediate access to cloud-based resources. So we're seeing organizations have to transition to these models as well, too. In fact, there's really functionally no reason why endpoints couldn't connect directly to these third-party distributed hosted cloud resources and still have access to threat prevention functionality, policy definition enforcement, and security monitoring and response. So when we say that the majority of organizations expect that their workforce can work effectively remotely, we expect these values to be extended to security operations teams as well. In fact, I would pose that as a question to our listeners today. Can your security operations teams work as effectively remotely as other aspects of your business? And Girish, I think I'd pose that question to you. And with that, I think I'd turn the talk over to you and talk about how you see this from the Sumo Logic perspective.
Right. Yeah, that is great, Scott. Absolutely. I recall doing a workshop many years ago talking about different security operations centers, models, distributed, physical, virtual, a fusion center, that sort of paradigms. But what we are seeing the evolution is and from our customers' perspective, is that concept of virtual SOC is here to stay for a long, long time. Maybe it's going to be the new norm. And Sumo has always been functioning in that fashion ever since our early days. So that's definitely one of the, I look at that as a very positive outcome of the situation that we are just about emerging out of. That is, things are going to be more virtual in nature. That is, obviously there will be some physical presence as well. However, we see that evolving to be more of a virtual SOC or equivalent function. Scott. Okay. So thanks, Scott. I think that was a great data points on the evolution of IT, the cloud and digital transformation, as well as how the emergence of cloud native security operations is taking form and shape. Just to give context to the listeners of this session, Sumo was founded 11 plus years ago as a cloud native startup, and we have been at the forefront of what I call the cloud innovation and cloud journey, helping our customers ever since we started offering cloud native solutions. To give some context, we not only have Fortune 50 representatives as customers, as well as customers of all shapes and sizes. So we roughly have about a little over 2,100 enterprise customers, all the way from, as I mentioned, Fortune 50 to smaller organizations representing financial services, healthcare, government, retail, tech, transportation, pretty much all the relevant verticals out there. So our customers use our solutions not only for security, but also for IT observability and IT operations, and now emerging observability use cases as well. What we are seeing, just to give some context, is that we categorize our customers' journey to the cloud in three broad buckets. The first one is what we call cloud start. This is when customers are getting started with the cloud, whatever that means to them, right? Often it is to add or expand specific use cases. They may be prototyping one or few use cases and say, hey, I'm going to tiptoe and try this cloud thing. This has historically been called as cloud migration to a certain extent. And I like to call it as cloud start because they're really getting started on their cloud journey, so to speak. Cloud first strategy is when there is some sort of a mandate. It could be top down from E-staff or CIO or CEO, or it could be bottoms up depending on what's relevant for the use case. However, there is a mandate which often comes top down. So what we are seeing is this cloud first strategy is adopted when not only when businesses have a corporate mandate and when they're looking for new solutions and they want to leverage the value of a cloud, like Scott highlighted. And this is often when they're actively building out new apps or new infrastructure and trying to secure that as part of their SecOps migration as well. What we have seen is the cloud-first strategy works well because enterprises can be more agile. The reference Scott had to DevOps value chains. They can realize business outcomes much faster at better ROI. This is because instead of building their own tech stack, whether it is their SecOps stack, like like to call it, they partner with the service provider who can provide the services, premium services at better economies of scale, and they get access to premium offers as well. So that's what I'm referring to as cloud first. Cloud native, that's the one on the top right, is what I'm calling born in the cloud category. These are companies like Sumo. We started our born in the cloud journey 11 plus years ago, and there are thousands of companies, tens of thousands, and maybe even hundreds of thousands of companies today that are all cloud native. So these are not only tech companies. There is a misconception that these are all tech companies, software companies. And to some extent, it could be, because as we all know, most companies are becoming tech companies because tech, they know, is an innovator and helps them achieve their business outcomes much faster. So for example, we have many customers who are cloud native because they don't have anything that even smells or looks like a legacy on-prem or SaaS. Everything is cloud native that they do. And there are traditionally regulated industries, financial services, health companies, healthcare companies are also now fall into the cloud. Many of them fall into the cloud native categories, the fintechs, the health tech like companies. The question for you is, where are you in your cloud journey? What we are really seeing is the likelihoods of you succeeding in the modern compute and security environment is better if you adopt cloud first and cloud native strategies as opposed to the lift and shift strategies which are often tried with the cloud migration or cloud strat approaches. Often we get asked, what do I really get from a cloud native solution? What I want to do is to highlight some of the key benefits that you would get in a modern cloud native security solution. Often there is a misconception actually that, hey, I'm cloud hosted, I'm cloud managed, don't I get the same thing? I can scale. Well, yes, maybe, and most likely no. I'll tell you why. So for example, some of our capabilities, we are leveraging not only cloud native technologies, we don't just flash events and say, hey, look, this is an event, go figure out what you need to do. We automatically generate actionable insights with full context so that the analyst is working on value-added activities as opposed to clicking through something and saying, hey, look, okay, I triaged this based on the training I got, and here it's off to the tier 2 analyst. No, you don't need to do that anymore. We actually flatten the analyst role and make it much more value-added in terms of making it interesting for them to do their daily jobs. A couple of examples is even during the pandemic, we've had several customers who adopted us over the other cloud-hosted or cloud-managed security solutions because they really liked the insights they were getting from our solution in a much with a much shorter time span. The other common reason is scalability. Our approach at Sumo is send whatever data you want to us, query however as much as you want, and whenever you want it. We won't force you. We don't restrict your searches to be 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever it may be. And we economically collect and analyze the data. If you say that your use cases, to Scott's earlier point about workloads, so if you say that search is more important versus dashboarding, we let you decide what is important for you. There's no one size fits all. We do get it, and we make it easy for you to leverage those knobs, so to speak, even in a cloud world. To give an example, I always like to talk about this example when it comes to scalability. As you know, in US, every year, it used to be in January, and now it's in February, there is an annual sports spectacle where 22 athletes on the field with helmets, they line up against each other where one team tries to score, the other team tries to stop them, right? End of the day, whoever scores more wins. So the use case for this was fascinating. That is, in a short time, they want to scale from tens of gigabytes to hundreds of terabytes and possibly even hitting petabytes. They want to prepare for that eventuality, right? So, and then when they looked at Sumo, a cloud-native Sumo platform, they realized that they could do this in a matter of minutes and hours, as opposed to days, weeks, and months with the so-called cloud-hosted approaches out there. So, in other words, we didn't really blink when the real traffic grew from several hundreds of gigabytes to hundreds of terabytes in a matter of minutes and hours. It was a non-issue for us. So think of scalability in that perspective. Scott talked about it. What we are seeing is a converged approach. It's not just security or security operations in isolation. What about the DevSecOps? What's the observability approach to things? This is commonly emerging themes, and many of our customers are asking that because they're saying, "Hey, well, why is DevSecOps like from an AppSec perspective different from SecOps? What's the convergence? What's the observability of your underlying systems? That is, security is not in isolation from other IT infrastructures and capabilities." We all know this. Security folks like to do the investigations. So while they may appreciate the modern heads-up displays, that sort of interfaces, but they really like the ability to go down, search across all security relevant data, which often is outside the traditional security purview, as you know. So we make it easy for our customers to do that as well. Cloud native, we don't care what you throw at us, right? So all security relevant data will absorb it, whether it comes from your own hyperscaler of choice or multi-cloud. It could be Google, it could be Amazon, it could be Azure. We allow all the hyperscalers as well as hybrid cloud. If you have legacy data on-prem, we have easy mechanisms to bring it back to Sumo. And time to value, right? End of the day, it's for your tier one analyst or a threat hunter, what's the content that's readily accessible for you to get going? So when people, the reason I put this slide is it's cloud native security solutions have been ready for prime time, and not only the smaller organizations have adopted it, but many Fortune 50 companies have adopted it at scale. And one question I always get asked is, hey, Sumo, what kind of use cases do you solve? And my answer to that is we solve all security and SIEM-related use cases, primarily SIEM, whether it is from a basic log management to detection, investigation, response, threat hunting, and more. In other words, the basic SIEM use cases, the advanced SIEM use cases, as well as the emerging use cases that may fall under what people are calling as XDR now. We have the ability to solve all of those. In summary, from Sumo's perspective, we have a modern SecOps solution, which is cloud native from an architectural perspective. What it really benefits you is it provides you not only the security capability, the platform, but also helps you address the observability related use cases. Scalability, it's proven. I won't spend much time on this, but some of the cool things about Sumo is not only do we support multi-cloud, single platform for multi-use cases, but we have a consumption and a credits-based licensing model that captures the value of how cloud is supposed to be consumed. And we're inherently secure and all the cool stuff. So that's a quick snapshot on what Sumo is about, and where we have seen customers succeed is adopting ideally cloud native strategies. If not cloud native, cloud first strategies are a great way to get started. Back to you, Tricia.
Thank you. It is now time for our Q&A session. Just a quick reminder, if you have a question, simply type it on the question box on your screen. It looks like we have a couple from the audience already, so let's get started. First question, with cloud-based solutions, can security teams baseline their security posture?
I'll kick off with that, Girish, but I think I'll turn that over to you. But in short, yes, they can quickly determine what the current status is of the environments that they have under management. They can also see what they don't have under management and under visibility into. Girish, I think you can speak to some specific metrics that Sumo customers can take advantage of in baselining their environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Scott, I absolutely agree with what you said. So it's interesting. Often when I get asked this question, it's about people think about, hey, machine learning and baselining, that sort of thing, right? So what's my user activity monitoring? Is it the norm or is it an exception? Yes, we do all those things. We do have security analytics within our platform and capability. I didn't want to talk much about the product. One of the cool things that we also have is the fact that we are built on some of the largest hyperscalers in the world. gives us the insight, and it is obviously anonymized information. We have insight from a metadata perspective of how does a particular workload or an application compare and contrast against their peer groups. We actually have that something called global intelligence service. So we in real time, we have insight into how is an application or a workload tracking, and the same things we can do that for security. We do have offers for security as well. That is, given a cohort of users, 1 versus the 25, for example, we have trends and analytics on how they perform and how they compare and contrast as well.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. In discussing the topic, you mentioned SecOps debt. What is meant by that, and can you give some examples?
Yeah, it's a great question. So SecOps debt, you hear a lot about concepts like technical debt, which is really, it's the cost an organization will be assuming, whether they're aware of it or not, when they inadequately invest in the technology debt, inadequately invest in a technology that covers the variety of use cases and demands to be expected of that technology, not just now, but in the future. In a practical sense, that means you develop and deploy what you need to today to just get something done, no matter how reliable it may be or supportable it may be, just to get an immediate obligation fulfilled. What you're actually going to need in the long run may require a fair amount more investment in that. You're effectively taking on that debt by committing to that functionality from day one. And if you're really relying on its availability and performance and so on in the future, you are going to have to build accordingly. So that's debt you assume from the outset by taking that on. And in SecOps, the analog to that is in twofold, actually. One of them is in terms of personnel. If you're taking on security operations, you do need the expertise to not only understand but respond to what's being seen in terms of monitoring and incident detection in the environment. That means you're going to have a plan for developing and cultivating, finding and retaining that expertise, and that's been a problem for organizations already, as many well know. But it's evident in technology as well. You have to be able to instrument your environment such that you have the visibility that you need in order to be able to respond to the issues of highest significance to your organization. If you don't have it, you're going to have to build in that direction, and that's driven some technology trends in security operations that we've already seen. Girish, I think you want to elaborate on that probably from the perspective of what you've seen at Sumo.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the way in which I think about SecOps, that is, there is a price to be paid for bad decisions in the past as well, right? So this could be how data was originally ingested, or the choices made regarding tools, the fragmentation of tools. So it's the staffing and the isolation of the teams, right? So that where identity and analytics and SecOps were all in isolation. So I look at SecOps in a broader context. Yeah, absolutely. So what we are seeing is really, from our perspective, the cloud native approach makes it much easier to overcome these with the not only with the unified platform, because the tools and technologies and workflows are all getting disrupted. And this is, and cloud makes it much easier to not only overcome the SecOps debt from a technology perspective, but also from an operational as well as the staffing perspective as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Girish. Thank you, Scott, for a very informative webcast. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you again for attending. And as a reminder, the on-demand version of this event will be available shortly. And on behalf of Sumo Logic and 451 Research, thank you for attending and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.